between his research fellowship at Johns Hopkins, he had residency training in child neurology at MGH, and in 2005 joined the staff at MGH. He is also the Associate Professor of Neurology at Harvard Medical School, and he can fill in whatever other parts of his life that he would like to when he comes up here. I think our hope when Kathy Sims left was that someone would come and be our kind of person to help us out with Norrie disease, and I think he's interested and wants to try to help us as much as he can. So I am honored and pleased to have him come up and present.
Thanks,
Thank
Jan.
you.
Thank you. Good. Can everybody hear me okay with this mic? Yes? Okay, perfect. Good, thanks for the nice introduction. And as was said, I stand here a little bit in the situation of trying to fill the big shoes of Kathy Sims, knowing well that I can't do that. But I hope I can, at the same time, show you a little bit about what has happened in the field of rare neurologic diseases overall, and how I think of the changing landscape, as well as identify opportunities for Norrie disease, and think together how we can make progress. So see this as a departure point. So I would say maybe 10, 20 years ago, when I was still at Johns Hopkins, being trained in another set of rare neurologic diseases, the leukodystrophies, really very few people cared about rare diseases. It was quite marginalized. It was sort of in the silo of a few academic researchers. There was maybe one company, Genzyme at the time, that took an interest in rare diseases. But over the past 20, 30 years, really so much has changed. And I've just noticed that in the close proximity here in Boston, across the river, with many new companies coming about and taking on diseases we never thought had a large enough number to attract interest from companies. And I think this is a good place to start in terms of thinking about the larger community that Norrie disease also fits into. We know today that there are 7,000 rare diseases and counting. Every year we're identifying new disease-causing mutations and disease-causing genes. And we've also found that, as I said before, industry and orphan disease companies have taken an interest, and there have been more and more also drugs approved by FDA for rare indications, and this has in part to do with the Orphan Drug Act that motivated a lot. That having been said, we know today that for these rare diseases to really find treatment, it takes much more than an academic effort. We found actually that it's the patients and the patient advocates, as you here also in the room, have played an active part in this, and there are more and more newspaper articles about the kinds of efforts and activism that parents and patients are showing, whether it's here for a paroxysmal biogenesis disorder, where some families in Canada rallied to look for a lipid correction, or here below, a mother who is brokering treatment for her twins and contacted NIH for a Niemann-Pick type C disease. I thought I would talk to you a little bit about X-linked adrenal leukodystrophy, in part because it has been the focus of my career, but it's also an X-linked disorder, like Norrie disease, and maybe there are some lessons that can be learned and parallels that apply here, both on the in terms of the effects upon the family at large, the inheritance pattern, the kind of conundrum of having affected and non-affected children in the family, often the plight of the parents as they know what they've passed on, and also the treatment options that we are now seeing emerge for disorders like X-linked adrenoleukodystrophy. Just very briefly, this is a disorder that affects a certain part of the cell called the peroxisome, and the gene encodes a half transporter that sits on the peroxisomal membrane, and its main function is to import a certain lipid called very long-chain fatty acids into the peroxisome. If it doesn't function, you see accumulation of these very long-chain fatty acids, and often boys between the ages of 4 and 10 are most severely affected. They develop some personality changes, attention deficit, then go on to lose their vision and their hearing, and in a year or two are either vegetative or dead. And what you see on the brain MRI is that their myelin is very severely affected, and there's a spreading of inflammation that really burns like wildfire through the brain. So a few years ago, we decided, given the severe plight of many of these patients and families in the rare neurologic disease space, we would start a center for rare neurological diseases and really address all those diseases that had a single gene cause. And the idea was that we could really leverage the biology of these single gene defects. If we knew what the gene was doing, we knew what the protein that was encoded, what its role was, we could leverage that biology. We could understand what it was doing. Was it producing some toxic substance? Was it simply a matter of replacing a certain kind of amino acid or lipid? And by understanding that biology really well and leveraging that, we thought we could make very quick progress in the field of rare neurologic diseases. So different from some of the more common diseases that are more heterogeneous, you have a very distinct opportunity here, because we know what that gene does, where that protein goes in the cell, and what its function is. We can move a lot faster than in some of the common diseases. And the idea was here to really bring together not just academics, but work together across industry as well, and try to implement strategies to create partnerships and advance treatment. And I think we are in a very distinct space here in Boston. We have the opportunity of having MIT right next door. There's a very famous institute called the Broad Institute that has been at the forefront of a lot of the genetic technologies and next generation sequencing. We sit at MGH, where there's a Center for Genomic Medicine, and we have some of the best trialists in the Northeast within the Neurological Clinical Research Institute. So we thought it's really interesting that we're able to now identify all these genes, but often these remain in the research area, and there's often a gap in moving from this diagnosis to an actual treatment and a way of instituting trials for patients affected by these genes. So we thought we can really bring together in this space and create bridges between these different institutes and create partnerships with patient foundations, advocacy groups, NIH, and industry. And in order to do that, we had brought together different people with different skills. Suze Laugenhaupt, who's in the Center for Genomic Medicine, one of the basic science leaders, Alex Sherman, who knows about databases and how to create registries and how to bring large data sets together, and myself, a clinician. And you've met some of our project management team and clinical coordinators. I think Kaylee Walsh has helped Casey to put together this, this conference. So the idea here is, again, are there people who can help coordinate not just clinical care, but also some of the research needs. One of the things we do within the Center for Rare Knowledge Diseases is bring together leaders, not just from academia, but also from industry. And we meet every other month here in the Bullfinch building to discuss for an hour and a half with really thought leaders from industry and academia, whether there are opportunities for rare diseases or challenges that can be tackled together. And we do this across departments in the hospital, and we think because we can have face-to-face meetings, we can be more successful in solving those problems. So a lot of the research that has resulted from these strategic meetings has materialized within the center. We have, on the one hand, a lot of preclinical work in the Center for Genomic Medicine, where we're focusing on neurometabolic diseases, hereditary neuropathies, some of the clinical developments happening in lysosomal disorders, leukodystrophies, and trials that are actively happening as well. The way I think of the landscape, really, if you think from going from preclinical work all the way to the bedside, if your goal of research is really to not just do things in a dish, but actually do something that can translate to the human condition and help a patient, then I think you have to think about the entire pipeline. And if you want to do that, you should think about all the pieces that are needed, from laboratory models to assay development, from drug screening to natural history studies that will inform trial design and get you all the way to a phase 1 or phase 2 study. Now, in each disease, and I would even say within a disease, for each symptom, there might be a different gap. So if you want to address hearing, or you want to address ambulation, or you want to address vision, there might be different gaps in that pathway. Maybe on the one hand, for that particular outcome, you're missing a good biomarker. Maybe you don't have any natural history data, but you have a compound available that's already looking quite promising. On the other hand, maybe you have an existing animal model for one indication, or an assay is available, but you're missing really the industry partner who can help with manufacturing. So I think it's really important to think strategically about the space, and in order to do that, you need to know what your outcome is going to be. This is an older slide from an older presentation. What I put right in here, right in the middle in my subsequent slides, is patient perspective, because it's all actually driven by unmet need and recognition by patients of what is necessary. So within MGH, we have developed a gene therapy program to serve as resource for investigators developing both AAV, certain nucleic acid approach, as well as cell-based approaches. You can deliver genes either directly in a viral vector, and usually these vectors are called adeno-associated vectors, or you can take cells from the body and you can transfect them with the virus delivering the gene. And these are usually lentiviral vectors that insert themselves into those cells, and those cells are then given back, and I'll give you some examples later. But what I think we've done nicely is we've not just helped support preclinical research at the bench, but we've said, actually, it's important that early on, the preclinical people, the people at the bench, start working with clinical people so that you can together start building teams and start saying, what is actually the most important outcome? What are the target cells that are going to change function in patients? And we've created nice partnerships here between the preclinical and clinical people across different diseases. So just briefly, a big part of this, I think, in the center is also mentorship. We're bringing a lot of new mentees into the field of rare diseases, trying to show them that there's real unmet need and real opportunities to do important science and build careers in this space. So we try every year to introduce new, young, talented investigators to rare diseases. Industry partnership has for many decades been something that academia has not wanted to engage in, because the famous ivory tower of academia has said we don't want to have anything to do with the dark empire of industry. Much has changed, and I think we all now recognize that we need industry knowledge. We need the knowledge of how to pursue a regulatory pathway. We need the knowledge that industry has around drug manufacturing. Many of these things are not things we know in academia, and certainly not something we learn in medical school. Likewise, industry needs the knowledge of the disease. They need to understand what the unmet need is of the patients, and they often come to us physicians because of that. Henry Termeer, who's founder of Genzyme, said to me, always sticks in my mind, that you physicians see eye to eye with the disease. That's what we in industry need, right? And I found that very, very profound and something that always sticks with me. And so it's really together in this partnership that we can help each other. And a lot of what we can do as here in academia is de-risk the early phase of development for a rare disease. And that's exactly what our center is aiming to do. For various diseases, for instance, ALD, we've built industry advisory councils. So we've said, if you're interested in working on ALD, but maybe you're just in a preclinical stage, you haven't committed yet, come and learn more. And we meet every 3 months with industry partners, and usually we present a patient story, and then there are different talks about biomarkers or outcomes. And it's really amazing to see more and more industry partners come to these meetings, because they really get a lot out of it, and it helps them understand why they actually want to work on these rare diseases. So I don't need to tell you about the importance of patient advocacy. We work very closely with various different patient advocacy groups, because we think it is the main motivation of why we are here and what we're doing. We need to hear directly from patients and be engaged with them in order to convince FDA that moving these drugs forward is essential. So a few years ago, we founded a patient advocacy consortium called ALD Connect that brought together all the different patient organizations within the ALD space, but also brought together the clinical centers across the US, as well as industry partners. And in short order, the newborn screening was brought about through a lot of the advocacy of these patient advocates, and we've now had newborn screening in New York and California, Connecticut, a few other states, and it's become a national recommendation, and it's rolling out so that we're finding more and more patients in early stages where we can treat much better. We've really focused a lot on patient engagement, and we've done this through establishing so-called patient learning academies. These are days where we spend not only telling patients why we perform clinical trials, why it takes so long to get a drug to clinic, but we also, in return, learn from patients what is important to them, and often learn that there are new symptoms that we didn't recognize before. And for instance, in ALD, we found that women who are carriers themselves also have disease burden, and things that they often didn't talk about because all the focus was on their children, on their boys. The siblings of patients affected by rare diseases have shared experiences of living with an affected brother or losing a brother to the disease, and I think that has been very empowering to them, and we've certainly learned a lot. Some patients with gait difficulties have tried on new walking devices. We've invited companies to participate who wanted to try out and exhibit some of their devices. We've also created a patient portal for rare neurological diseases. The front page says it all. Who knows the most about adrenoleukodystrophy? You do. It's the patients themselves who live day to day with the disease they are the ones who understand most about this. It says, no one else understands the toll this disease can take upon families, relationships, and friends as you do. And when you go into this portal, you have a chance to use various different surveys, some surveys that allow us to understand what priorities families might have, what kinds of resources they're lacking, what kind of research they would like to see. And then there are also surveys that help patients in terms of monitoring their own health. And we call one of them Neuro-Tracker, and it allows patients and families to keep track of their neurological health day to day. So the thing that it seems to me most families and patients are looking for is treatment. And so the main goal of our center is to move clinical trials forward. And we do this by understanding the pipeline from basic science all the way to the clinic. We try to, by raising disease awareness, by creating these patient portals, these consortia, enabling rapid recruitment for trials and implementing them as fast as possible. And one of the trials I'll talk about is a gene therapy trial in ALD. So just very briefly, I told you that X-linked adrenoleukodystrophy was a single gene disorder that affected boys and left them often either vegetative or dead within just months or years of onset. What we know is the only treatment that can stop that rapid progression is a bone marrow transplantation. And that's been done for about 20, 30 years. That similar to what has happened in the cancer field, people said, okay, this is a terrible disease, let's throw the kitchen sink at it and see if something works. And ALD was one of those few disorders where bone marrow transplantation actually helped, but it had to be done in the early stages of disease. And it also came with an enormous price, and that was often engraftment problems or side effects of medications or side effects due to something called graft versus host disease. I won't go into the details of it, but a lot of this was because for the bone marrow transplant, you were using a foreign donor. And so that donor, those donor cells were often not recognized by the patient themselves, and the patient's immune system reacted to them. So what we decided we were going to do was something different. We were going to harvest the boy's own bone marrow cells, put them in a dish, and then transfect them with a lentiviral vector, delivering a healthy copy of the gene, and then give those cells back. So why do we think this works? We think that this works because there are certain kinds of cells called microglia in the brain that actually derive from the bone marrow. And those cells that you're now putting back into the bone marrow can wander from bone marrow to blood, where they're monocytes, and then from blood to brain, where they can become microglia. And this was a big effort that happened over the past 10 years, really required many different centers and experts working together, but we're very close to now having not only a trial completed, but a first approved drug for this devastating disorder. A lot of people told us, oh, this is such a rare disease, you will never get this trial done. This will never actually happen. It'll take you years to recruit. What actually turned out was that within the first 6 months, we had reached the recruitment goals that were set for the first year. Patients came out of the woodwork from all over the world. We were seeing patients, a lot of patients from South America, from Europe, from Asia, even a few patients from Africa. And we were really quite overwhelmed by the interest. And so I think if you build it, they will come. Just here briefly to outline how gene therapy actually is conducted. The boys, after we identified they had a lesion on brain MRI, their bone marrow cells got mobilized with GCSF. The bone marrow cells then were transduced with the lentiviral vector and delivering a healthy copy of the gene. They get a little bit of chemotherapy, busulfan and cyclophosphamide. The cells go back, and then they're followed for 2 years. And what many people asked us is, how do you know that this actually works or that the gene got in? Well, if you look at the peripheral blood, you actually can see vector copy in the peripheral blood in all patients at last follow-up. And all of those cells that had vector also produce protein, because we found that about 20% of those peripheral blood cells express the normal healthy ALD protein. And did it change neurologic function? Yes, it did. In 15 of the 17 patients we treated stabilized. The higher the score here, the more neurologically affected they are. And you can see that most of these patients actually stabilized within the 2-year period. There were 2 patients, one was already progressing very rapidly who died. Another patient dropped out of the study. But this is very different from what you would see in the untreated cohort, where most of the patients progress very rapidly. So I'm coming now to what you probably wanted to hear from me about, but I haven't talked about, which is what can be done for Norrie disease. And I hope just by talking about some other single gene disorders, I can set the stage and say maybe we can begin a conversation on what are the needs and what are the kinds of things that should be pursued. And I just put some topics here, but it will be something that one could discuss together. You know, can we continue natural history studies? A lot of things that Kathy Sims started over many decades. Can we modernize registry into an online version? When Dr. Sims retired, she came to me and this is what she gave me. It was a box, okay? And this box here is sort of what I've been keeping in my office, thinking, how can I live up to you know, this legacy that Dr. Sims passed on, and without, at the time, ever having met a patient with Norrie disease. So this has changed now, today, that I'm sort of meeting a lot of the patients with Norrie disease. And I guess one of the questions is, can we create an online version of this? Is this something that you would want to integrate into your, you know, maybe your patient portal or your website? Can we understand together the care and research needs? On the one hand, you know, you will understand, well, what is it day to day that's important to you. I was listening to Michael's fantastic talk this morning and thinking to myself, well, you know, I can contribute something, but how much more does he actually have to teach us? And I feel a lot of the patients here probably have a lot to contribute and tell us. So what is it on the basic science end that needs to be brought forward to the clinic? Can we identify gaps in addressing each symptom? And how do we do that? And again, this comes back to the slide I showed you before, where I think for each symptom and moving from bench to bedside, there are different gaps, and understanding what those are, we can make progress together. So I just want to close with this slide by saying, you know, you've heard a little bit about the landscape of rare diseases, what kinds of things have become possible for other genetic disorders. Is this applicable or not? You know, is a point of discussion. But how can we, you know, through partnerships facilitate progress? This needs to be interdisciplinary. I think one of the things I've come to appreciate is that rare single gene disorders often cut across different organs. They don't respect the boundaries of our disciplines. You know, I'm just because I'm a neurologist doesn't mean that all the problems that a patient of mine has fall into the domain of neurology. You know, we know that there's vision problems, there's progressive hearing loss. Are those things that we can partner with others here at Mass Eye and Ear with? I think patient involvement is key, and how to work with industry. And I think that is certainly something that has changed dramatically compared to 10, 20 years ago. So I think, in short, I'm glad to engage and help in any of these questions. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
I have one.
Sure.
So I guess I want to know where we begin. Because obviously we, as a group, we have a lot of needs. Norrie's is so varied. I guess
Yeah.
your background's not Norrie's, but
Yeah, no, I can talk to you about how I think of this, and it may or may not fit. So it starts with the patients, and starts with the unmet need. And it starts with you prioritizing what you think is most important and where the biggest gap is. And once you do that, a lot of things fall into place. I was at a conference of another rare disease a year ago, and there was all this wonderful basic science. And I remember, all the patients also being in the room with the scientists. It was a fantastic group, but I said, so what do patients actually care about? And in the subsequent discussion, it turned out that actual visual interaction or visual engagement was one of the most important things to them. That parents felt like they lost their child because they couldn't see anymore over time. And that was something that was completely lost on the basic science aspects. I mean, they might have had some of the tools to address this, but it hadn't been clear what the goal was. So I think some of this it really helps move the discussion along and create certain focus if you start with understanding the unmet need. Not to say that it's the only thing, but I think it's an important driver for progress.
and then how do we get this database? Because I know Dr. Sim started that database, and it looks like it's. How do we get this database going so that we can, because I think in the past and with NIH, they look at, numbers. So I think I mentioned in one of the other talks, there are way more people out there in the world with Norries that haven't been brought into our group. And so even though it's a rare condition among families who have Norries members, it sometimes is not rare. I mean, we could have several people in one family. So to our each individual families, it's pretty significant, but to NIH, they may not look at it that way. So we definitely want a complete database, and then to add to it. So, I mean, I think that's really important as we go forward and try to get the numbers and, work with you and whoever to try to justify, if we're going to be writing letters or whatever. So how do we translate that into, an online database that we could add to?
Yeah, so I'm completely open to what, I feel patients are the owners of their own data, okay? So I think there's been often a misconception over the years that academics own patient data. I think when you sign a consent, you are actually allowing the institution to use the data for some purpose. But it's very important what it says in that consent. And in part, I think some of the historical data, it's hard to deal with it because often the consent doesn't allow, for new sharing or sharing outside of that specific purpose. But these are things I think that patients and families should start talking about and deciding, how can we, bring together the community, share information among ourselves. How can researchers, academics, how can the information that Kathy Sims collected over years in terms of genetic information help inform maybe differences that you're seeing in clinical symptoms? So yes, I think all of that is possible.
So on that front, our first interaction with Florian was me reaching out to take that survey that I had put on the Facebook group and to see how I could connect it with the efforts that Florian had. And this is when I first heard about the box and all of the other things. We also have our UK friends doing similar things. And as Florian mentioned, some of this is he has to worry about the patient confidentiality issues. There's a lot of stringent rules around what he can do with data and what questions he can ask, and he has to be very specific about this. Same thing goes on in the UK. We as parents it's our information. We can choose how we collect that, ask wider questions, and make sure that we work with the clinical community and the research community to ask the right questions and to make sure that we're doing it in a way where they can use it.
It can be used.
Right? So what we hope to do is to tie it in with the, I want to say Neurobank registry that they have available, and we need to see with Amina and all the UK folks, how we tie that in. So we have a global registry, because as Florian's slides showed, there's a global population of this community, right? As with other diseases, and if we reach out to that, I think we can be there to be that partner for MGH and other researchers and the private sector. So it's something we're working on. Join the board, help out.
It's a small task, but it's all doable. Yeah.
Are the blood samples still around? When we did these questionnaires a couple conferences ago, they were.
I'm trying to look for Kelly Burke in this room, but I don't. She's not here. Oh, she's coming tomorrow. So maybe that would be a question for her.
I'm not sure what purpose they would have at this point, but it would be nice to know that that's around, or whether or not there's any role for further collection of some sort of specimen.
Yeah. No, I think that's all true. And would be well worth pursuing. I mean, I think what Kathy did was a lot of DNA work, and I think that, you know, the DNA, at least the results are available. You know, in this day and age, one could probably do further work looking at gene modifiers, and looking whole exome, whole genome, and many of those things might help also you know, facilitate interest in Norrie disease. So.
Nathan, did you have a question? Nate? Did you have a question?
No.
Oh, sorry.
I'm showing this box not so much to say, you know, here's the data that I'm keeping from you. It's more sort of, I want to show that this is something we want to, you know, bring forward and learn how to modernize and make available in the right appropriate ways. And part of it has to do with sort of, you know, whatever IRB language there was in place at the time. But, you know, reconsenting is possible, and people can give permissions again.
Is it as simple as figuring out like the correct wording to put on surveys, you know, to make sure that we ask, you know, appropriately people's permission to use this, as far as the hospital being able to use it? Is it like a certain wording or a certain contract that we'd have to have people sign or something to allow that? As far as the parents doing a survey and handing it to you guys, to you?
Oh, I see. So what we've done in the patient portal is you can do online consenting. You actually go into the patient portal and you scroll through language that you consent to, and then it prompts you to generate something called a global unique identifier. So if you put in all your different demographics as well as certain information only you would know, it generates a unique code. And why I mention this is because one of the challenges in the rare disease field is patients go to different centers and they are often entered into different registries, and you have duplication of data. So how to avoid that, NIH years ago came up with this method of a global unique identifier, and we adopted that. And so you sign consent online, and you also generate a global unique identifier, and then that data can be linked to data collected in the hospital.
I think that Mark and I hope to add to the survey that we have currently, and we want to make sure that obviously it's usable information, you know, going forward, and all work together in making sure that's so, then it would be better for all of us, you know, a worldwide community, and be able to take this information to London where things are happening, and to everywhere. I think the wording needs to be just so. To make that.
Yeah. And for patient advocacy groups, it's actually much easier to operate
Yes.
than for physicians in hospitals, where we're bound by certain rules and HIPAA and all that, right? So it's a little bit different depending on where you are. But you also want to be in the position to know, if you want to publish your data, that you got consent in the right
Yes.
way.
I guess my question is somewhat related to that, in that you were discussing the collaboration between physicians from different disciplines. And I was just curious, within the rare disease community, in terms of like physician research, to what extent is there collaboration, you know, on between hospitals on national and an international stage even?
There's a lot of collaboration, particularly in the rare disease field, because each center sees so few patients, and in order to make this work, you need to work together with others. So I would say most rare diseases are actually, if not in effect, aspirationally international groups. So they really try to do this across the world, and then it's most often sort of language barriers or other socioeconomic barriers that are preventing people from participating. But I think, you know, speaking to the different disciplines, it would be important, and I think something the center here can also help facilitate, bringing together, you know, fellows from neurology with fellows from ophthalmology, or from, you know, Mass Eye and Ear working on you know, acoustic issues, and fostering that kind of interdisciplinary work. Knowing well that you might learn something from this neighboring organ that's important to your own research effort, right? So I think we're just at the beginning of this, and I think disease like Norrie could be pioneers in helping bring that about, right? So we, you know, all these boundaries of I'm a neurologist versus an ophthalmologist, they're all artificial, right? We came up with this maybe 200 years ago, and it's time to, you know, step over these. So.
I'm just wondering if there is something that we could do to try and entice both the industrial aspect, the pharmaceutical or other genetic researching companies, as well as a researcher, to undertake this. How is there something we can do to approach them to stimulate their interest other than throwing money at them?
So the most important thing you can do, that I as a physician can't do, or as a basic scientist, is speaking to your plight and what the unmet need is of your community, your child, and articulating that as well as you can. And I'll say you've got plenty of articulate people here, as I heard this morning. So I yet have to hear people in academia speak as well. So I think you have those people, and it's a matter of just sharpening the focus and saying, you know, while we have incredible persistence and talents to overcome obstacles, there are at the same time things that we need help with, and there's an unmet need that we need addressed, or something of the sort, right? And adding that human dimension, and in, you know, not in a sense of a sob story, but in the sense of very real day-to-day burden of disease, okay? I think describing that as clearly, as granular, as detailed as possible, there's nothing better that you can do that's important both for researchers as well as for industry. So yes, of course, money makes a difference too, no question, but there's no shortage of money in the world, I think. So.
I'm going to miss the parent meeting breakout session tomorrow, but hopefully we'll get information on who we need to write, because I have no problems writing letters and also reaching out to the people. I have information for the state of North Carolina in terms of the deafblind census, more on the academic standpoint, and I'm also a part of the National Center for Deafblindness, so I can identify just off the top of my head 5 families. So I can get information to them, but because of the HIPAA laws, I can't give out any of their information unless I get consent. So, but there's a way around it. We just got to be creative and make sure that we're reaching the right people that can be advocates and make a difference. But I do know that, and my son goes around, he does a lot of talks, and in every speech that he's done, the surveys have pretty much said they really enjoy talking to, hearing from the person, the self-advocate, the person that can identify firsthand what they're going through, what their needs are. And so as much as possible, we can have our self-advocates speak up and let their voices be heard. I think we can, as parents, can help to make a change.
So I completely agree with that, and I think there's power in numbers, and that comes through disease awareness. And the other power biologically that you want to be aware of and leverage over time is the earliest identification possible. So the sooner you come to diagnosis, the more is possible in terms of treatment, in terms of technology, and because the later in the disease you are, the harder it is to reverse something, the harder it is to have a treatment that is as effective as in the early stages. Now, this is not to say that there are needs in all stages of the disease. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying, regardless of stage of disease, you want to try and get as early as possible. And that's why newborn screening has been such a glimmer of hope for many, because through the newborn screening, you know, gene therapy can be much more effective because you're doing this in a body where cells have not yet died. You know, so there's still something that's receiving the gene correction. You're doing this where structures are still retained. So just putting that out there is another, you know, thought. If you can raise awareness, you can articulate, you know, to your politicians, to your various Congress people about this disease and the needs, and you maybe can get to newborn screening, you could get to an early stage where a lot more might be possible.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How do you here
Decide what conditions, rare diseases are to be studied? Like Kathy Sims, is this something she was just passionate about and took on her own? Or, I mean, I work in a surgery center and, you know, they tell us what to do, you know. But, I mean, how do you decide, like, is it, you say, well, this disease is my passion. So what latitude do you have, or other physicians here, researchers, to say, hey, you know, we want to take up Norrie disease as a cause? You know what I mean? Just for every place has a political, you know.
I mean, I think it's relationships. So
Yeah.
I think, you know, passion, I think, you know, there's tradition, there's mentoring, there are many different things, right? There's,
Right.
you know, personal experience. Often
Right.
it just takes one patient to have an impact with their story on a physician who wants to do this.
Okay.
And I think,
So-
you know,
Florian, will you be here tomorrow? Well, not here, but in the Simchies. Will you be around? Can you make yourself available for any period of time?
I'll try.
Because we're moving on to we have to move on
Sure.
to our next.
Yeah,
speaker.
yeah, I
I
don't
know
wanna
that there
take
are
more
plenty
time.
of people
Yeah.
that have
Yeah.
questions for you.
Yeah. I'll try, yes.
All right.
Oh, for sure. Sorry, I
Thank
didn't
you.
want to take
Thank you so much.